Hey everybody, let me pull this up here. If you're looking at a screen, which you may not be, I have an image of General Georgy Zhukov. He becomes, during World War II, the head of Soviet armies, arguably the most important general in World War II. I'm sure that some Americans, and I might be part of them, would argue Eisenhower. I actually think Zhukov is more important than Eisenhower. I'm not sure if Zhukov's more important than Marshall, who was in Washington organizing all U.S. troops. Marshall was amazing. So was Eisenhower, actually. I admire both of them. But Zhukov's important because the real meat of the fighting in Europe happens between the Soviet army and the German army. That's not to say that what the U.S. did in North Africa, Italy, and Europe, Western Europe, wasn't significant. But it pales, to be honest with you, in comparison with the fighting that went on between the Germans and the Soviets. It just can't compare in terms of just the sheer volume, the death, the horror, really. But we're not there yet. We're not there yet. The reason I brought up Zukov, the image, is that we ran into him or we met him at the end of class on Tuesday, and very briefly I'll recap. On page 77 of Story, you might want to take a look if you just want to get your sense of bearings. Um, in 1939, the Kuomintang Army did what was quite characteristic of that renegade group. It tried to push into Mongolia, or the Mongolia People's Republic, which the Soviet Union saw as its territory, its protectorate. The Japanese did not do this. The Japanese army did not do this at the behest of Tokyo. One of the things I've talked about constantly is that there's no single ruling power in Tokyo, unlike Moscow or Berlin, even Washington or London. Um, and so you could have units on the ground taking these actions that had these immense repercussions. The same is true with the occupation of Manchuria in 1931, or even the Marco Polo incident to a certain extent, the Marco Polo Bridge. So, long story short, Zhukov's forces, Zhukov had, probably because he was a junior officer, had escaped the purges of Stalin's general. Stalin had decapitated the high officer corps of the Soviet army in the late 1930s because he was paranoid that they would turn against him and lead a coup. So most of them had been arrested, tortured, and murdered. But Zhukov survived. This is one of the reasons, by the way, the Japanese went into or tried to go into Mongolia. They thought that the Russians were leaderless. It turns out that Russia has much more depth or reserves than either the Japanese and especially the Germans thought. And Zhukov's forces, mechanized forces, tanks especially, just decimate the Japanese. The kind of thing that we'd see later in Europe after Russia gained its bearings after the invasion of Russia in 1940. But let's stay in Nomahan. Let's not get too lost in the weeds here. So Zhukov defeats the Japanese at Nomahan. This incident, the Russians defeat the Japanese. Very significant consequences. Number one, Stalin signs a non-aggression treaty with Japan, so Stalin does not have to worry about fighting a two-front war, which he was terrified of doing. Stalin basically is at peace with Japan until the last 3 or 4 weeks of World War II, which is kind of an incredible fact to think about. It's kind of amazing. So Nomahan allows Stalin to focus on Hitler, and during the Battle of Moscow in 1940, Zhukov will be called to Moscow to help save Moscow because Stalin doesn't have to keep a lot of troops in the eastern part of the Soviet Union because he's not going to have a war with Japan. Okay, number one. Number two, the Japanese are checked severely. The army loses a bit of its prestige. It had been riding high up until then. And the Japanese start to focus on capturing resources since they're not going to capture the resources in the Soviet Union, they start looking to places like Vietnam, the Dutch East Indies, which is today, of course, Indonesia. Vietnam has a lot of rubber, very, very significant natural resources. The Dutch East Indies, Indonesia has a lot of oil. Um, uh, and so Nomahan forces the Japanese to start looking towards a Pacific War, which is going to be basically a naval war, or a naval war in many respects. So by Nomahan, what that does is it forces the Japanese to look to the Pacific, which means that there's going to be tension and ultimately a war between Japan and the United States. It's not inevitable that there would have been a war between Japan and the United States, especially if Japan had been able to capture a large portion of the eastern part of the Soviet Union, but it didn't go down that way. Also, if Nomahan had been a Japanese victory, Stalin might not have been able to defeat Hitler. So, little known battle with huge consequences. So, this idea of a two front war is very, very significant. One of the videos that you're watching, the longer one today, the documentary, it talks about Hitler, especially his decision, his fatal decision. It's really one of his two or three biggest mistakes in invading the Soviet Union. The other one would be declaring war on the United States. But what happened before that was his decision to invade the Soviet Union when he couldn't conquer Great Britain. So, long story short, let me get to the point. Stalin doesn't have to fight a two front war. Hitler does. Okay, and that's what you'll be seeing. That's what you'll be seeing in these videos today, these documentaries today, along with some good background of what was going on during this period. So think about that as you're watching the videos. Think about the global consequences. I don't think either video, it may talk about Nomahan, but I don't think it talks about Nomahan too much. Okay, now let's go back to China. Mita doesn't talk about Nomahan too much because it's not really the Chinese war. It happens on the edge of China, the occupied area of China, the area that Japan had occupied. But he's much more interested in the war in China itself. So for the Mita readings, what I want you to focus on is what occurred. It's a static war. It's a quagmire. The Japanese think they're going to defeat the Chinese in 3 months. And let me tell you something. If you ever hear a country saying they're going to defeat another country in 3 months, you know that country, the invaded country's in trouble. It usually, countries that are overconfident when they go to war usually end up humiliated. And Japan's not humiliated yet, but it's involved in a quagmire because Chiang Kai-shek refuses to surrender the Japanese. It's a sacred trust. He's the legacy of Sun Yat-sen. He is not going to be the guy that allows China to slide back into the humiliation it had been suffering, mostly at the hands of Western powers, up until the 1930s. So Japan is involved in a quagmire. In China, there's not much movement. Chiang Kai-shek's government moves to Chongqing, where it remains for the rest of the war. It's never pushed out of that region, although it's bombed very heavily. That becomes the nationalist capital. And what you're going to see in the next part of the Mita book is the toll that the war takes on China, but also, I think more importantly for today, the war led to certain kind of social dislocations that have affected Chinese culture and society, state and society to this day. Really, number one, just this idea of a Chinese national identity, which China doesn't have before World War II. I think that's the big argument of the Mita book, that World War II creates a national identity for China. One of the other arguments in the book is that the Chinese state, both Mao, the communist in north central China, and Chiang Kai-shek, the state demands more of people, and in turn, the population of China starts to demand more of the state. This is one of his arguments too. So what you're seeing here, you'll be in the films, you'll be seeing we're going to shift our attention. You're going to shift your attention to Europe, but in the reading, I want to stay focused on China, so that you, again, I want you to leave the course with a good sense of what's going on in China and the consequences of World War II in China, not only towards the outcome of the war, but also in shaping modern China, which in 2019 is our greatest economic rival, very quickly becoming a political rival, and perhaps, though I hope not, a military rival.